Board of Governors in 9 years. So this is to have the 7 of us here. It's the first time we've done a meeting like this in 7 years. So in 9 years. So it's terrific. So these sessions started just a few years ago in 2019 in what turned out to be a very different time. They were valuable then, and we've continued to benefit from them as we've navigated the pandemic shutdown and the path to recovery. So we started with listening sessions around the country that brought together people and organizations representing businesses, low and moderate income communities, workforce development enterprises, employee groups and unions, community colleges, retirees, and many others. We wanted to hear directly how our monetary policy decisions were affecting people's daily lives. So then the pandemic comes and upends everything, the way we work, live, learn, and conduct business. And we kept these conversations around Fed Listens going. And we thought we gained valuable insight, which continues to help guide our policy decisions. And I also think we delivered good transparency about how the Fed works to the American people through this process as well. So these events have now become a permanent fixture of our broader outreach. And my colleagues and I I'm sure we remember each one of these events that we've been part of. They're really the real life embodiment of our policies and the way they affect the people that we serve. And they do inform our thinking as policymakers. So we continue to deal with an exceptionally unusual economic set of disruptions. As policymakers, we're committed to using our tools to help see the economy through what has been a uniquely challenging period. The insights you share in these events help us to home in on the challenges and opportunities that are shaping what we might think of as the new normal of the American economy. And it'll inform us as we try to get there. So my colleagues and I are very happy to hear from our participants today, to host those of you who are tuning in to listen, and to do the work that we do on behalf of all Americans. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Governor Bowman, please.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so pleased to be here with you all today in person to moderate today's discussion. And I just want to express my thanks to all of you for your willingness to travel to Washington, D.C. to be with us here today for this Fed Listens event. Over the past year, we've held a dozen Fed Listens events across the country, hosted by our reserve banks. And we found these conversations to be a very valuable resource for us as policymakers. Hearing directly from people in different communities about how you are experiencing the economy helps provide important context for the economic data that we consider. These discussions help us develop a richer understanding of how economic conditions are impacting people in their businesses and everyday lives. And it helps us think about how we can best achieve stability and support for the economic well-being of all American families. Today, and in other Fed Listens events over the coming year, our intent is to shift the focus of discussion toward understanding how the pandemic experience has reshaped the economy and the workforce, and the challenges and opportunities that we will face during the transition to the post-pandemic economy. So with that, let me turn to our first set of panelists, who bring with them direct knowledge and experience of how the economic landscape is evolving for U.S. businesses. They represent organizations that include small businesses, manufacturing, supply chain management, and the hospitality industry. I know that all of you have experienced firsthand the extreme economic and financial hardships brought on by the pandemic. And during the economic recovery that has followed, you've likely also seen rapid and substantial changes in supply and demand conditions in your industries and in the communities where you live and work. Given those lived experiences as business leaders, we are especially looking forward to hearing each of your perspectives. And as we hear from each of you, I'd like to invite my colleagues to follow up with any questions that they may have. So let's start with our first panelist. I'll introduce Tom Henning. Tom, thank you so much for being here with us today. Tom is the CEO of Cashway Distributing, a wholesale distributor of food products for convenience stores and food service establishments in the Midwest and the Great Plains region. Cashway began in 1934, delivering candy to local grocery stores in Kearney, Nebraska, and the company now manages an inventory of over 20,000 products. Cashway has remained privately held by the Henning family, with the second and third generation family members involved in the business today. So Tom, for our first question, could you please describe how the pandemic changed the demand for transportation and warehouse services? And to what extent are shortages of material and labor still affecting your business and industry?
Thank you. The pandemic changed demand for transportation and logistics services in some manners that were expected and some that were unexpected. After the pandemic, we expected a fair amount of pent-up demand that would be released, and it was. In fact, probably the demand that existed out there was greater than what it was pre-pandemic. But what wasn't expected next, before the pandemic hit, was the demand for workers would exceed the supply by a larger margin than what existed pre-pandemic. The size of the workforce became much smaller than it was pre-pandemic. We also believe that many left the workforce, and for a variety of reasons. And we were wrong on that too. We really thought the workforce would grow. There was a shortage of truck drivers and warehouse workers prior to the pandemic, which the pandemic further exacerbated. The shortage of truck drivers before the pandemic was estimated at 61,000 drivers. Today, the estimated shortage is in excess of 80,000 drivers. The shortage of drivers was an issue then, and it'll be a much bigger issue now. And the prediction is it will be an issue in the future. We've seen some estimates that the shortage will double by the year 2020. And to give you an idea of the size of the driving force that is out there, the universe of truck drivers today is 1.53 million drivers. So you take, a 5% shortage, a 6-7% shortage, it's going to be significant out there. As a result, the cost of labor has increased significantly for everyone in the supply chain. With the supply of labor down, the competition for drivers heated up immensely. There was an extreme amount of pressure on the transportation and logistics side, and still is, and probably will continue to be for the foreseeable future. In order to attract and retain drivers, our company raised our wage rate 3 times in 2022 so far. In 2019, we gave all our employees free health care. And then we gave all our drivers and warehouse workers retention bonuses. If they stayed with us to the end of the year, they would get a bonus paid out on the 30th of January. And that did much to solidify the workforce. Then there were the supply chain issues. And the shortages of products we sell every day from our supply chain vendors was significant and still exists at higher inbound fill rates from our vendors every week. We have a number of metrics that we utilize every week. Our inbound fill rate from our vendors was 99.2%. So for every 100 items that we would get in or we would order, we'd get 99.2 in. Our inbound fill rates, right after the pandemic started, dropped down to about 55-60%. By December of 2020, it was up to 90%. And in 2021, we had a pretty good start, and then it dropped to 78 to 80%. And this year, it was probably in the 80% range, 82% range. And for the last 10 weeks, it has been running 90%, which is good news. We changed our inventory philosophies because we had many customers out there that depended on us for products. So we started loading up our inventories. We used the popular inventory philosophy of JIT, just in time, and then we changed it to JIC, which is just in case. So we're over inventory, but those people need products. A restaurant who has got an event planned for Friday night and you make a delivery Thursday and the product isn't there, he's in trouble. And it's all, our business is all about customer service. As a rule today, most of the time, we don't know what we're going to receive from the vendor, and which is kind of unusual. There are many challenges for the vendor community out there. A lot of it has to do with raw materials. They have labor problems also. They've got priorities on certain lines that they're producing. And so anyway, most of the time, we don't know what we're not going to get until the truck unloads, or we might have a call from that vendor, which is a switch from the norm. And the timing of deliveries is probably not as great as it was pre-pandemic. Since the pandemic began, our vendors have eliminated over 900 items that we no longer have. And especially in the convenience line, that's where we really notice it. You know, between wages, worker shortages, the price of fuel, and the supply chain challenges, our costs have really skyrocketed. We believe and have gone through our numbers and look at the inflation numbers. We look at our inbound freight rates, understanding that we get probably our products from growers, from shippers, from manufacturers. So they have freight into their establishments, and their freight costs have increased. We have got freight from their establishments to our warehouse, and then we've got charges, freight charges basically, that are built into our pricing to our customers. And we've been trying to calculate what percentage of the food inflation is relative to transportation and logistics. And we've got kind of a consensus between all of us that probably 38 to 45% of the food inflation that we're feeling right now is because of logistics and transportation. It could be greater. It could be greater than that. We do a cost index report on our total product mix, and we do that every week. We started doing that about 25 years ago, and because obviously you've got to have growth, and you've got to have organic growth, and the difference between the growth you're realizing every week and inflation is basically organic growth. So our cost index report, and I've got numbers from, I think, since 2020, indicate where we've been, the path we've been on. This last week, our inflation rate was probably the lowest it's been in, I'm going to guess, probably 4 or 5 months. It was down to 10.3%. But yet, compare that to what the inflation rate was the same week a year prior. Our total inflation from 2021 is probably 22, 23%, in that range. So we're seeing some drop there along the line. We're also seeing some softness in the marketplace, which probably is indicative of why the inflation rate is lower. On the other side of the coin, we still have increases coming through. We're still struggling with product shortages and labor. Product shortages are occurring for a variety of reasons. One of the big factors that's going to have an impact on inflation, probably yet this year and probably next year, is the drought we've been experiencing. I can tell you right now, and we hear this from the potato growers, we've seen the price on what we call baker's potatoes double in the last couple of weeks. And this last year, the potato growers in the Idaho area, which is really the prime country for growing the kind of potatoes a food service establishment likes to have, they knew they weren't going to get water. So instead of planting potatoes, they planted wheat. And so now there's going to be plenty of wheat that comes out of there, but the potatoes are going to be thin. There's an extreme drought that's hit in California. And California is a big producer of food that we consume. One of the products we're not going to have this year is going to be pears. I remember in 2012 when the drought hit, and we sell a large number of school districts, we imported fruit mix. We imported peaches from Israel. And Israel has, and that was probably the only place, some of those products were available. So we may be in that same boat here down the road. Tomatoes are a little bit on short supply. The other thing that's happening, we're in the corn belt of the country, along with Iowa and Illinois, and we've had a lot of drought there. We're finally starting to get some rain. One of the things that happened last year, and you've read about this and you heard about it, because of the war in Ukraine, the price of fertilizer, nitrogen, potash, and phosphorus just went off the charts. Nitrogen went from like $200 a ton up to $930. I know for a fact there were many farmers out there that were doing a balancing act. How much less of this can we use and still grow a crop? And what does that add to my costs? So my guess is going to be that we might find our production of maybe corn and soybeans maybe down a little bit this year. And depending on what happens next year and the experience factors they've got there may have an impact on whatever some of the commodity prices are. The beautiful part in our area of the country is that the cattle market is good, and we're starting to get a little bit of rain now. But if you look around the world, you go into South America, you go into China, you go into Europe, and it seems like every continent is having their share of drought. And so this might be a factor all in the future for food production, and especially the near future. And that's just a personal opinion. Labor is still an issue. The driver pool is still far from being adequate. We have a driving force of 250 individuals, and we have positions we work to fill every week. There was a time during the pandemic we were short 20 and 30 drivers. We have one supervisor for every 10 drivers, and they drove all year. They drove vacation routes, time off for other drivers, and the like. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn that on. If I can find it.
Well, been there.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Interesting ringtone.
Maybe to our second question, which is about what your business outlook for next year.
I was just going to get into that.
Okay, great. And what other challenging issues might be facing and expecting to face?
Our business outlook for next year is good. I wouldn't say it's great. First off, we sell commodities. Our company was founded in 1934, and that was during tough times. It was founded in 1934, and the products we sell are really, in a sense, recession-proof. They're people have got to eat, so we're looking for probably a fairly decent year. On the other side of the coin, there's going to be casualties in the marketplace, and we could have some short-term challenges out there. And the way we're dealing with that is interesting. We're working programs right now to keep our customers profitable, and we're reaching out there because they're the lifeblood of the organization. And I think during the recession in the 80s, there were a lot of folks that didn't have a lifeline. Communication wasn't great, so we're reaching out to those folks now. We need to see them through this thing. And it's not a matter of extending them more credit. It's not a matter of giving them some type of stimulus along the line. It's helping them better manage their business, make it more profitable. So that's going to be one of the challenging issues we have. The other challenging issue we really have, and this is critical, I think there's I can't tell you exactly, there's over 2 billion trucks in this country. We have not been able to upgrade our rolling stock, stock for probably 2 years. We have 250 tractors, we have 400 trailers that we need to make the deliveries. We haven't been able to acquire a new tractor since November of 2019. We typically replace 10% of our fleet every year. The last tractors that we purchased in November of 2019 cost $106,000, and it's pretty much a standard product that we buy. Got 5 coming next week. They're $165,000 a tractor, 40% increase. Plus, we've got to pick slots now. We're guaranteed kind of halfway of having probably 20 tractors. We really need 50. We're guaranteed to have 20 tractors in 2023. So we're gonna spend probably 5, 6, 7 years getting things caught up in our fleet. The cost of putting trucks on the road today is very significant. It's gone up right around $80,000. So that's going to have an impact on transportation total. And when you look at the number of trucks in the country, and the options aren't great. We had a number of trucks sit this last year for 7, 8 days because we didn't have microchips. They were 2017, 18 models. The parts availability, tires is one big thing. On trailers, insulation, we had trailers we ordered 2 years ago that we finally got in the first part of this year. Those went up 40%. So 40% sounds like probably an average cost increase that we're going to see with rolling stock for any operation out there. So I think I'm getting down to the end.
Tom, how does that inflation and cost for these necessary replacement items, how does that impact your outlook for going forward, or changes to how you prioritize expenses in other areas?
One thing about it, you got to have the cash flow to do it, and you've got to have. So that will be the challenge in developing a plan, a business plan, which we will do. I think in our company is sound and solid. I don't see a problem there. But I do look at other companies in the industry, and I think they will have some challenges there along that line. And there's some options out there that they can certainly use. But it's going to be a challenge. We spend more money today on just maintenance. A vehicle gets so old and you have a problem. The other thing we need to do that's going to be important is we need to get the manufacturing of a lot of those component parts back here in this country. And I could give you a list of things that we have to source outside of our country that put us really in somewhat of a predicament when it comes to keeping your trucks on the road.
Thank you. We'll probably follow up with you to learn a little bit more about that. But I'd like to ask my colleagues if they have a question.
Yeah, just a couple, one narrow, one broad. The first question is, are you able to pass these costs along? You obviously have been hit by, costs right across the board. And the second thing is really, do you feel like we're getting through this process? There was enormous disruption to your business and many others, and all these cost increases and shortages and everything. Do you feel like, and I guess there's not that much progress with the drivers, but do you feel like we're getting back to a better place with the suppliers and the customers yet? Or is there a sense of progress?
I think there is a sense of progress. We're making the move, and I think the moves you make are extremely important. And I think that'll get us in the right direction, and applaud you for it. I do think that I do think that we're moving maybe a little faster than what I thought in terms of the economy and everything. So no, I'm confident we're going to get there. We might be, the only thing I'm not confident in, I remember when the pandemic hit us, they said, oh, in 30, 45, or 60 days, things will be back to normal. I think what we're encountering right now is going to take a period of normalcy. It's going to be probably 2-3 years off, 4 years off, maybe. We've got to get caught up. It's not going to happen overnight.
And on costs, you've been able to pass those right along? Since
Yeah,
these are-
we have. Yeah. And the dollars we work with are large enough and the customers really don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. We can't lock in old pricing unless they've got contracts somewhere out there. We can't lock that in. And so they end up having to pay it. They're so voluminous right now that part of the problem is you don't know what the cost is. If you asked me what the cost of eggs were, I could tell you probably in a few minutes because someone just told me what they were paying here a little bit ago. But, it's fast and furious.
So despite the higher prices, demand is still there. Strong.
Demand is still there. And I suppose it's a question of the amount of money that is still floating out there, in the economy. The bad thing is it's going to be the lower income people that really take a beating. And anyone that's in production, if they're in sales, if they're in manufacturing, whatever the case is, their salaries have kept up, drivers and everything. But we've got a layer of people out there that haven't had a lot of opportunities for increases. In fact, right now, one of the things we are doing is taking everyone that hasn't had an increase and figure out how we can give them one, and how we can give them one that's substantial enough. So that's going to be a challenge, probably for everyone down the road.
Thank you very much, Tom. We appreciate your perspectives, and we'll move on then to our second
Thank you.
panelist, Chidi Kumar. Chidi is the chef and owner of Garland, a restaurant and performing arts space in Raleigh, North Carolina. Chidi's a self-taught cook who studied recipes while pursuing a career as a guitarist in several rock bands. She was a semifinalist for the James Beard Awards Best Chef in the Southeast from 2017 to 2019 and was a finalist for the award in each of the past 2 years. Chidi participated in our board Fed Listens event last year, and where she shared compelling stories about the challenges that she faced running a restaurant business during the pandemic and in the early recovery period. Chidi, thanks so much for being here with us in person this year so we could actually meet you face to face, so that you can share also your perspectives on how things have changed since last year. So our first question for you is about how your business has changed actually since we spoke last year. How does customer demand now compare to what it looked like before the pandemic? And have you seen changes in dining patterns that you think could be long-lasting?
Thank you, Governor Broman, and thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here. So our restaurant, music venue, bar complex is one building that we have been paying rent on since 2010, and we closed our doors at the end of August. So, there were many factors leading to that decision, and most of them are really, I want to say at the outset that I'm a restaurant owner, I'm a chef, and we're working on a new project. I am speaking from my perspective as an independent restaurant owner. Restaurants are ubiquitous. You can eat at a fast food chain, you can eat at a fine dining chain that's in airports and hotels all over the country. Their perspective is going to be very different than mine, and I almost wish that we had a different name for our sector of the industry, because our challenges are unique and the way we approach those challenges are very different, because the math is very different. So for us, so many factors led us to decide to close our doors, and the main thing is that dining patterns have changed. Our restaurant has been located in city center of a very small city. We're the capital of North Carolina, and we're surrounded by government buildings and, law offices, a lot of tech companies, architects, small firms of that nature. We relied on presence in that aura. People would come to lunch, and whether they ate with us or not, they were aware that we were there. There was mostly, professional white-collar workers. Well, they didn't work downtown anymore, and they discovered new eating habits. They cooked more at home. They got food from CSAs, farmers, which is awesome. They discovered their neighborhood restaurants, and they just approached dining out differently. And they didn't maybe want to make a trek downtown and struggle to find parking and navigate construction that has been ongoing. Construction has not slowed down from my perspective. In fact, things take longer to build. And I know this because we're building out a space right now for our new project. So the project starts, and then you wait 2 months for an electrical, a little breaker switch or whatever, 2 months. Or for a meter base, which are just nowhere to be found, or copper, or whatever it is. So we're not the only downtown that has a lot of construction just sort of dragging on and on. And that doesn't really invite people to come to your restaurant, right? I go to Nashville and I see the streets are dug up for years, and there's a restaurant right behind that. It's very easy for people to say, let's just go somewhere else. And they discover a new spot and they go there, and there are a lot of options when it comes to dining out and dinner and how you approach your food for your family and for yourself. So we're very cognizant of that, and that's a very mercurial kind of situation. And during the pandemic, all restaurants, I think, were faced with decisions on how to pivot, the P word that keeps rearing its head. And so we all tried things that were completely outside of our normal way of operating. Fine dining restaurants started doing meal kits and takeout, and so you could get, maybe you were mailing something from Goldbelly. So we're doing things that are completely different for us. We're not built out for these kind of operations, but we did them. And so you start thinking about different ways to operate, and the consumer is kind of connecting with you in a different way. So things are still really very much in flux. I don't think that we've settled into what an independent restaurant looks like and what this industry looks like, and I don't think that we're going to get there for another 3 to 4 years. But in this meantime, people who have 1 or 2 shops can't really sustain this much change and these many losses for that long. If I had 100 shops, making a very small profit or very small loss, it's an aggregate. You're looking at the health of your total business. But for us, several weeks or several months of, what are pretty big losses for us, very difficult to navigate. So we're trying to, within our footprint, within the menu that we are known for, within the type of service that we do, the way our dining room operates, how many people we need to work in the kitchen, how many people we need to prep, how many people we need to get a guest from the door to the table, and then what happens after they place their order, and all of those little steps. Restaurants are basically dependent on a series of repetitive steps, and all of those are very time sensitive. There's no malleability, there's no work from home, there's no take your time, because if the guest has a bad experience, you'll lost them forever, right? And if you don't know that that's happening, because as an owner operator, you're also working, you're no longer just overseeing. You're washing dishes and you're cooking and you're prepping and hosting and bartending, and my husband and I have done all of these things many times over the last 2 years. You're going to miss those details, and that kind of, all these little cuts kind of cut down your business, and they cut down the level in which you really want to be operating at, and that the guests, expect. And that's not to say that I think we did a really good job, but it's exhausting. We're two people, we're a family operation, and places like ours, our staffing situation has been just like Mr. Henning alluded. it's always a difficult industry to staff, but now it feels impossible sometimes. I do feel like it's getting a little bit better, but we've lost a lot of our young people who we might have considered as career hospitalitarians. They maybe want to get a job in tech sales or go back to school or maybe become a nurse. Well, that would be an ideal way to go, but we can't really compete with those kind of benefits. We can't compete with not working at night. We can't compete with work from home. We can only offer so much paid time off. And that demand kind of gets sucked in by, or completely obliterated by people getting COVID. And, so from the start of the pandemic until this May of 2022, we had maybe 3 people with COVID. And between May and August, probably 80% of our staff had COVID at one point or another, myself included. And we are very careful. We test all the time, we mask and everything. So, the way the pandemic is affecting day-to-day life isn't as data-driven as it is now. It's just a reality, right? So if a cook is out for 7 to 10 days, I mean, in 2019, that would be like, you can't do that. That's unheard of. Like, what do you have, the measles? Like, what? That never happened. But now we have to sort of think about how many people we need with those contingencies built in, but yet the cost of each person's hourly wage is, 15, 20% higher. Our revenue is unpredictable because of the way our demographic in our part of the city is. And if there's a variant that was raging, that was more of an issue maybe last year when it was. Now it's just everybody gets COVID all the time, it seems like. So it's not this like wildfire that ebbs and flows, but we've had to sustain the losses throughout that time. So, so we have our labor costs going up, and then your question, Chairman Powell, was, can you pass that increased cost down to the customer? Well, we're the customer. We're the end game, and we can only raise our prices so much. So when you go to a restaurant, everybody goes to a restaurant and they see a chicken dish or a pasta, an entree that maybe previously in a nice restaurant was $28. Well, now it's maybe $34, but you're not going to pay $45 for it. I mean, you're just going to say, that's insane. I can make that at home. And, you think you can. Some things you can, and some things it may not be quite as good, but it's still dinner, and you'll survive. So there's sort of this like we reach a ceiling of not being able to have anywhere to push those costs for us down. So we see fuel surcharges on our invoices from deliveries. And again, as an independent restaurant, I'm a chef operator. I make creative decisions anyway about how I cook, what I put on my menu. I work with a lot of small farmers, but they're leaving too. They're getting tech jobs and web design jobs because it's hard for them to find somebody to help harvest their crops and bring them to us. And, it's a small operation. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that directly answers exactly your question, but there are so many factors that go into a very simple decision on where am I going to have dinner tonight. And it's everything from your location, what happens in your neighborhood, where do you live, what's around you, how much are you prioritizing, supporting local, are you feeding a family, or are you, a young couple with disposable income, who is able to operate? Is the restaurant that you normally go to able to have all of their sections open? Or did 4 of the 7 servers that they have call out today? And so you still have to open, but you can only sacrifice so much of what you can and can't do. You can't say, hi, welcome to our restaurant. We have 3 of the 9 items from this first section available today, and 2 of the entrees are available. I'm so sorry. You'd be like, oh, what is this? Like, I'm never coming back here. But in reality, I wish we could do that, because sometimes you just really have to say, can we open or not?
Well, thank you so much for your excellent answer to the first question. It was so good. You answered my second question, which was about inflation. So if there's anything you would like to talk a little bit more about, you talked about wage inflation, but the input inflation, you talked about how you can't pass it along. Are there other concerns? And I would like to open it up to my colleagues too.
I have a quick thing to add. I think real estate is such an important component of small brick and mortar places. Real estate has been thriving and growing and booming, and that's great. But developments are happening everywhere in every city in the country, and the starting rent is a certain amount. So as in previous times, 30% of your revenue food costs, 30% labor, and then you have your operating expenses, blah, blah, blah. Now, labor is hovering around 48, 50%. Your food costs have gone up to 35. So there's 75%. Credit card processing fees keep going up 3.5% to 4% off the top. Rent is now, where does it fit? After a point, you get to 100% and you haven't paid all your bills, and now you're operating at a loss. So, for us, we were fortunate enough to be able to buy a building, and that kind of changes everything. But we're lucky. We utilized an SBA program and worked with a local bank, and we've been in business for a dozen years. We have a presence in our city. But that's not the case for everybody, and that's not accessible for everybody. So, rent going up and everything else going up, and the ability of a small independent restaurateur who has a dream and a vision and really wants to invest in their neighborhood, they may or may not be able to do that in the future.
Yeah. So thank you for that presentation. Just have a quick question. You said that this was a performance space and restaurant. Most of the conditions you talked about had to do with the restaurant business. Are the conditions the same for, it seems like they would even be worse during COVID for a performance space?
They absolutely are. We never actually reopened the performance space once the pandemic hit. And our space is very small. It's 250 people. So, it just wasn't safe for so long. All the touring bands canceled their tours, and because we're a small space, we really book small bands, and they're either on their way up or on their way down. That's where we get them. So, it's expensive to tour. Gas is up, hotels are expensive. It's maybe not safe. Your record came out, you're not selling records anymore. Everything is digital. So all of that math has changed. Maybe people have gone to see their favorite band in an amphitheater. That math is totally different. So small performance venues, that's really hard. You can't really sustain that kind of business 365 days a year with local bands. You just can't do it.
Governor Jefferson has a...
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question around your strategy towards your workforce. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you had a team in your prior business that's closed down, and now you're transitioning to a new project. Is your strategy to try to retain those workers that you're familiar with, such that if we're thinking about the economic impact, there's some possibility that those people might be redeployed in your context? Or is what you're doing now so different that it really is the case that these are workers that were released into the economy, they have to find other engagements and things of that sort?
It's a little bit of both. We did retain some folks for a really long time. We've had some staff that was with us for 6 years, but then most of them were in the last 9 months. We offered 2-week severance to everybody, that we paid after we closed. We offered, an open door. Please come back and work with us. When we reopen, we have a couple of people that we retain and going to pay through this transition. So, it would be a very different situation, and the timeline and how all of that worked would be different if I didn't know, and that most of my team could go and get another job. And in fact, I really helped place a lot of people with a new job with restaurants that I like and that I know, operate with integrity and pay their staff well and treat their staff well. If it had been a different time, we probably would have, said we're closing in 2 months, and it would have been a lot slower. But I know that most people can find a job very easily, but even still, we gave them enough time to find that work, be paid, and then help them find another position.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone, for all of your excellent questions. We'll move on to our third panelist, Jess Pettit. Jess is a Senior Vice President of Commercial Strategy, Insights, and Analytics at Hilton, a leading global hospitality company with a portfolio of 18 brands comprising 7,000 properties and 1.1 million rooms in 122 countries and territories. It's a pretty big role. So in your role at Hilton, Jess delivers customer performance and economic insights to Hilton's leadership teams and partners. Jess leads the only fully cross-functional global analytics team in the hospitality industry, covering brands, digital, call center, new hotel development, and other key corporate disciplines. Jess is a born and raised hotelier and has committed his career to his passion, the impact that hospitality has on society. So Jess, we'd like to hear a little bit about how this past summer has impacted your business and hotel occupancy rates compared to during the pandemic. And then where were those customers coming from? Was it for recreation, business, conferences?
First off, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's truly a privilege, and thank you for all you all do on behalf of all of us. It's an interesting dichotomy between Chidi and I, and the large and small business. Although I'd say many of the same dynamics exist in what we're seeing from a hospitality industry perspective. And I struggle to imagine an industry that was dealt as difficult to blow during the pandemic, 80% down plus in the depths of it. And it's been a challenge, but also, I think at least on the positive side for hospitality on our end, starting to see that real recovery. And it starts with leisure travel, to your question. Over the course of this summer, but also last summer, our industry shifted much more towards a leisure focus. It ties very closely towards disposable income, stimulus. Folks had more money to spend on travel. So, complete opposite of 2020. The dynamic in 2021 summer and 2022 was this concept of revenge travel, right? You had not seen your families. You haven't seen your friends. You haven't been able to go to the national parks or see much of the country. And so revenge travel was a very real thing for us. And we see that dynamic in leisure markets, so consider beach markets, Southeast US. You see that dynamic in national park markets. You see it in long weekends. The holidays, we become much more compressed from a business demand perspective. And so over the course of the summer, we saw our demand from leisure travel, so when you account for all seasonality and all the other noise, up 10% versus 2019, right? And that's overall from an industry perspective, which is great. But then you realize that there's another 50 or 60% of our business, which comes from business travel and group travel, right? And in order for our industry to truly have the compression it needs to be successful for our independent owners, is you need all three parts of that three-legged stool to really be successful. So what have we seen over the course of this summer, right? So leisure was doing very well. We started to see the initial signs of corporate travel coming back. Starting the beginning of this year, corporate travel was down closer to 25-30%. Now through the summer, we're getting closer to that 10% down range from a demand perspective. Group travel, obviously, for all the reasons you talk about events, all the reasons that group was the most depressed from a demand perspective, we saw that in our industry, down roughly 35% in the beginning of the year. By the end of the year, we expect that full year number to be closer to 15-16% down from an industry perspective. So you're seeing the recovery, and it's very much as we would have predicted it back in April of 2020. We built our first models, and we said the first thing that was going to be coming back was essential travel, what Tom talked about earlier, the folks that we needed to travel across the country. Then we saw leisure travel small businesses which needed to travel in order to be successful. And we saw a bit of an air pocket there before we saw large companies coming back and then finally larger groups. I think, the other dynamic we see, and I often use this story from my own experience, weddings and events, right? We went from nobody being able to do that in 2020. I was meant to get married in 2020, first in June, then in September, then in June of 2021, and then finally in September of 2021. And the dynamic you see is there's compression, right? Everybody had that same experience. So I went from a Saturday at one venue to a Sunday at another, right? And so that's a very similar sort of pattern that we've seen cutting across. Yes, yeah. I think maybe revenge babies as well. Which, yes, I have a 10-week-old at home now. Hopefully he's awake watching this. So yeah, we've seen some of those dynamics from the rest of the market come back. And so it's not just been about leisure periods. As we get into September, we're seeing some signs of life in all segments. But by the end of the year, we're still going to be down overall demand for our industry around 5%. And that's when you take into account leisure up 10 and then everything else a little bit lower. And so what does that mean? I'll jump a little bit to how that impacts price, right? Because we similarly are downstream from a price perspective, right? We're impacted by labor, we're impacted by food costs, a variety of other supply chain related things. When we look at our price on a year-over-year basis, I'm sure folks see it if they're traveling, you could see prices that are up 20, 25%. On the whole, our industry forecast prices are around 15% up year over year. But when you account for inflation over a 3-year period, so comparing to 2019, our real average daily rate, we're still lagging 2019 levels. And it's really because of that lack of compression from all of the market segments coming back together, right? And so I think that's going to be the interesting thing to watch is as we hopefully see demand reach levels across all customer segments, then price would follow in a similar way.
Do you think that the pandemic experiences reshaped the way the industry operates?
Yeah, and so I think a couple things that I talk about there, and it kind of alludes also to the last question. There is a tale of two cities, right? And it's interesting because you see resort markets, drive-in destinations, they have been doing quite well. Extended stay hotels have done really well. Again, Tom's Market and other markets like that they've really supported extended stay travel. What we haven't seen is really the return to urban markets and large conventions, right? Those are the lifeblood of major cities, right? And so we're starting to see that recovery, right? But there's obviously pandemic risks and other things that folks have been considering. We need that overall return to desire of travel. And so we're starting to see that come back. And so Las Vegas and Orlando, we're starting to see that sort of turn back up. Markets like San Francisco, Chicago, New York, not as much, right? And San Francisco, obviously much more dependent on the tech market, which has been quite, different than the rest of the overall business community. So we're seeing a little bit of that. I like to think about sort of where do we want to get back to normal versus what's going to be a new normal that we expect, right? Back to normal is return to normal segmentation. Folks are able to have their social weddings and events, get back to regular meetings, normal travel patterns, right? The students being back in school matter to us, right? Because people tend to follow the school vacation schedules. So as we see that come back to some form of normalcy, we're starting to see normal travel patterns come back. From a new normal perspective, there's a couple things, right? We're seeing the emergence of what we call workations, right? The idea that people can work from anywhere. Right? So I'm not sure if that's the case for you guys, but in many cases, folks are saying, hey, I can not be in the office for a week. And what we used to call leisure travel, right? I had a conference in Las Vegas. I'm going to stay there for a couple of days and stay over for the weekend and all that, is actually something broader, right? That we start to see some return to a new customer dynamic where they want to have a larger room and stay in a place that they can, work during the day and connected to the internet and all that good stuff, but then at night they can do all the things they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. It doesn't impact all customer segments. Obviously, those with families still have to follow regular school schedules. hybrid meetings are interesting, right? I understand you guys were doing this in a remote fashion, right? We need folks to get together like this. We're not sure what the future of a meeting like this, where half the table's over television and half is in the room. That's an emerging potential trend that we're going to all have to figure out, right? Everybody's been on conference calls where it's extremely uncomfortable, where you're the one who's not in the room and everybody else is. So we've got to figure that out, but that will lead to some sort of new normal. And then the last thing I'll just call out on the sort of new normal is emphasis on digital tools, right? So for us, that's, folks were trying to skip the front desk, right? That there's a little bit of a different model in how you engage with people in a COVID type world, which means you want your key on your phone, whether you're flying or you're in a hotel room. So we've had a heavy emphasis on that in our business, but we're seeing that as sort of a change in customer dynamics, which undoubtedly could shift sort of the labor model where hopefully team members are able to focus more on service as opposed to transactions. Transactions can be handled more digitally. And then just touching on labor, similarly as Chidi said, our industry's been hit dramatically from a labor perspective. We're still 400,000 jobs less than where we were from an accommodation sector. We see it in all of our hotels. And when you think a demand environment where on the weekends you're busy and during the week you're not, right? That's a difficult thing to labor schedule around, right? And you don't get the consistency of scheduling that our team members demand and expect. We're also seeing, the inflation of wages in our industry broadly double what is the broader wage inflation. So typically in the 12+% range, we've seen across sectors and across regions in the U.S. So we're seeing some shifts in dynamics from that perspective.
I know Governor Cook has a question.
Yeah, please.
The data thank you for the presentation. The data that you're presenting are for the U.S. or are they global?
U.S.
Okay.
Yeah, although we see similar trends. I mean, it's such that it interests you. We do see similar trends outside the U.S. One interesting dynamic is, take Europe as an example. It's so much more dependent on cross-border travel, right? And so obviously that was more depressed when cross-border travel was more of a challenge. Here we didn't have as much of that. But major U.S. cities, right, the lack of international travel into New York or San Francisco has certainly played an impact on demand.
And taste preferences?
I'm sorry?
Taste preferences, same kind of thing?
Yes.
Sort of.
Yeah, generally we see that. I mean, focus on the U.S. from a customer perspective, but yeah, we see those sort of trends. I would say obviously there are countries where it is quite different. China obviously is a different sort of customer environment, but yeah.
I think Mr. Brainard had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the labor question. So, if you look at where employment is actually down relative to pre-pandemic, 1.4 million in in-person services, it's heavily in leisure and hospitality in your sector. Is that because people aren't coming back to that sector, or is it because your demand is down and so you're not demanding the same level of employees?
It's undoubtedly a mixture of all things, right? And as somebody who grew up working in hotels and is passionate about that sort of service economy that we had, it's in some ways can be less enticing of a job in a COVID type world, right? Essentially they were essential workers having to be face to face in ways that us in corporate office world we're not necessarily having to do. So I think there's an element of that which is we need sort of a mind shift back to where we were and the value in face-to-face experiences. When I think about what we're trying to do from an employment perspective, it's hard to get people to come back to work. So I think it's a little less of the our demand isn't requiring as many folks coming back. I mean, right now, as I said, we're close to 5% down from a demand perspective, so not massively for that level of job misplacement.
So can I ask just a related question? So recently I was talking to a large firm in leisure hospitality, and they were talking related to what Governor Brainard just said, that their turnover rates, job turnover rates had doubled than pre-pandemic, that even when you can get workers, you can't keep them. Is that something you're seeing in all these areas?
I'm sure we would see something very similar. We're all competing for the same subset of folks, that it's a smaller pie that we're all competing for, right? So you see certain places where folks are putting out big bonuses to try to convince people to come their direction. And then we have to all, go back and forth. And so the pie of workers in our industry broadly is just not wide enough.
So regardless of what we do for demand, you're still going to have demand for labor.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's the case.
Well, Jess, thank you so much, and congratulations. We hope you're getting some sleep. So, I appreciate you being here with us. Our fourth panelist is Kara Walton. She's a director at Harbor Results, which is based in Southfield, Michigan. Kara leads the company's manufacturing intelligence business, which collects and analyzes millions of data points from thousands of manufacturing companies in North America. Harbor Results collects data from more than 600 privately held small and medium-sized manufacturers each year. Kara and the team at Harbor Results utilize these data and information to help small to medium-sized manufacturers improve their competitiveness in the marketplace. Kara also studies economic, business, trade, and tariff trends impacting the manufacturing industry, and she consults with clients on their business impacts. So Kara, thank you so much for being with us today. Can you help us understand what your most pressing concerns are for the small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I really do appreciate it. As you said, right, we work with the small and medium-sized manufacturing base. We're also a small business. We have about 15 people total on staff, so we're quite small. But beyond working with those small to medium-sized individuals, generally they're all less than $500 million. Some of them are $5 million companies in a year, and some are 700, right? But generally speaking, they're under that range. We did the math in our organization to give all of you a sense. It's about $30 billion in an annual year. That was incorrect. And it's $30 billion annually in terms of total output that they're putting out in the market. So to give you a sense of what they're looking at, they're privately held, they're not consumer facing, so they're supplying to a tier one or to an automaker or an appliance maker, and they're generally not unionized. So these are they're small and they're family owned, right? Sometimes we have second and third generation leaders. Our team took some time to kind of come up with an answer to this question, and we broke it into two core facets. Their biggest challenge from our perspective is labor, and we'll talk about that one a little bit. And then their second biggest challenge is the ability to make money. So if I could start with the labor piece, frankly, there are many facets to it, all of which I cannot answer here, or else we might be here for a while, as I'm sure similar to you guys, but I'll do my best to give you a high-level explanation. So the number one core challenge that our people have is that they can't find people, number one, and more specifically, they can't keep them. So in some cases, they are absolutely getting people into the door, and then they're not sticking around. This goes far beyond production workers, so I absolutely do have clients who have challenges where frankly, sometimes Starbucks, or we're in Michigan, so the Tim Hortons or something like that will say, we'll give you a $1,000 signing bonus. We absolutely have companies who are losing employees to that, but it's also a skilled labor challenge. So we're lacking skilled labor, we're lacking people willing to even go into apprenticeship programs, and we're lacking office staff. One of the things that you guys talked about was that you don't have the ability to do work from home, nor do these people. At the end of the day, they have to make pieces and parts, so they don't have that capability similar to a tech world either. I want to be clear about one thing as we kind of talk about the labor challenge. At our core as a business, we focus on making sure that the only answer isn't adding people. We want our businesses to be efficient and to be productive, but they truly can't even find enough people to be efficient today, which is the big problem. Anecdotally, I was talking to a plastics processor this morning that hired 14 people last week. 3 of them showed up this past Monday. 1 of them left at lunch. So, and this is not the only person who says this, right? I hear these stories, and our team hears these stories all the time. So one of the things that we really see, right, is despite all of these businesses offering really high-paying jobs and offering career development tracks and they're paying really big bills to train these people, right? They say, hey, come in with no experience. I'll make you a tool and die maker. I'll make you a process tech or whatever it is. They're not able to even find the people willing to go in to take that level of education. And what we see happening when we look at the data is that a lot of our manufacturing clients stopped hiring during the Great Recession because, frankly, you guys know better than I do, their businesses were quite challenged. So they stopped hiring at that point in time when a lot of millennials were graduating out of college. And frankly, that gap is really rearing its head today. Not only do we have an average age of an owner, right? The average age of an owner is over 60. We have an average aging workforce overall. We don't have succession plans, not for key leaders or for other areas of the business, right? So if I have a production manager who's in his late 60s and says, hey, I want to retire in the next 4 years, there's no one there that's even considering being the next person to be that production manager. You lose a production manager, your facility doesn't run. So beyond that, right, what we're really watching in our bottom line is that it's costing these guys a lot of money. And what they're starting to tell us and what the data is starting to show us is they're choosing not to grow their businesses, which is a big challenge, right? So they're saying, hey, I'm not going to take on more revenue because I don't have the people to do the work. Or in some cases, they're even saying, I'm going to shrink my business, which brings me to my second point, their other biggest challenge, which is they can't make money at the rate that they used to be able to. You said there's a lot of compounding issues and everything. There's a lot of compounding issues in this one as well. But some of the core pieces of it that we're seeing is that despite these businesses increasing their efficiency levels, so they're absolutely doing better from an efficiency and throughput perspective, they're not making more money. So when we look at their actual profit margins, they're not going up. They're frankly going down quite substantially. It's due to a lot of different reasons. One of them is the labor piece, which we talked about, so I won't go into too much more detail there. The other piece is this overall cost of doing business. So it's everything from energy prices, it's transportation costs. The rail strike was a really big, or potential rail strike, was a very big challenge to these individuals. Healthcare costs, and everything from temp agency upcharges, right? So when somebody's trying to get temp labor in the door, it's 30 to 40% higher than it used to be. Interest rates on loans is a big one. Most of these companies do not have cash. They're privately held, but they all use lines of credit. So that's really impacting them as well. The other piece that's preventing them from being able to make money, at least consistently, is they had a lot of PPP or ERC funding, just depending on the type of business. Most of them did get that because they are privately held and small. Some of them used it better than others, right? Some of them used it as a lifeline and frankly just delayed some of the challenges that they were feeling before COVID even took its toll. And now that that money's dried up, they're feeling those same challenges again. My final piece on kind of their challenges from a financial perspective, which is potentially the most challenging to quantify, but I did my best to put it into numbers, is this increased chaos that they've felt over the last 24 months is really preventing them from being able to make money. So the best way I can kind of articulate that to you is that most of the customers and companies that I work with don't know their customer demand. They don't know the schedule on their shop floor. They frankly don't even know who's going to show up to work in a given week, and in some cases in a given day. I mean, there were periods of time in 2020 where we would talk with customers who would say, I got into work today and 8 things changed between 7 and 8 a.m., right? So they don't know how to do this. At the end of the day, what that's doing is that's driving up massive amounts of transactional waste. It costs a lot of money to hire someone, even if they never show up. It still costs money to get them and process them and give them healthcare and all of that. Additionally, it's tying up a lot of money in inventory. So we've seen massive shifts in inventory right now. And the final thing is that it's really costing them way more cash than it ever did before. So their ability to have any flexibility in terms of how they spend their money and how they make money is gone. And at the end of the day, right, this is a massive group of people. They're not all the same, but the viability of many of these businesses long-term is really concerning to us.
Those are very difficult challenges that you're dealing with. Could you give us some perspective on how supply chain issues are continuing to impact your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will flip to the final page of the notes. So from more of a supply chain perspective, we are based in Southfield in Detroit, Michigan. So we do work a lot in the automotive space, but we also work in others. I personally came out of the appliance arena, so we work across most of them. A lot of the challenges today seem to be around semiconductors. That's a big thing that seems to get picked up a lot in the press. It is absolutely an issue. I'm not going to belittle it. But there are a lot more problems than just semiconductors. To speak on the semiconductor one just for a second, some of the core challenges that we're seeing is not only does automotive need semiconductors, but your refrigerator needs semiconductors. There was like a new PlayStation that came out last year, and that needs semiconductors. A lot of people talked about it. PlayStation and Xbox are confusing to me, but either way. So that was demanding microchips, all of these different things. So automotive companies can get them, which means that this whole demand problem that our customers are facing, they have no way to plan when they're going to get chips in order to put them into the parts that they're ultimately supplying. The other piece on the semiconductors, just real quick, is that when you think about an electric vehicle coming into play, they require at least 30% more, sometimes even more than that, than an internal combustion engine does. So if we adopt more electric vehicles, we're demanding more semiconductors than we ever have before. But beyond the semiconductor challenges, probably some of the more concerning things to me and maybe less easier to solve challenges from a supply chain perspective are centered around things like transportation and freight, which all of you talked about in different arenas. But a lot of that applies to things much more than automotive as well, right? So you talked about the agriculture business. We work with companies who can't get washers and bolts to make trailers to hitch on the back of their F-150s to get whatever they need to get, wherever they need to get it, right? The other big supply chain challenge that we don't really see a light at the end of the tunnel for is natural disasters. You talked about it from an agriculture perspective. There's a lot of impact to that on the resin and steel markets as well. The resin market specifically, there are certain types of resin that ultimately allow you to make your dashboard or make some of the plastic that we probably have in this room right now. The capability for them to get that resin even before the most recent round of natural disasters occurred, some of the major freezes that happened last year, it was already in force majeure. So these companies were already taking the time to go, we need this because it's a crisis, and then it got worse, right? And that had nothing to do with any of the port challenges or any of the difficulty getting a bolt out of China or somewhere else. So that was one of the big pieces on the supply chain front. I guess to bottom line it for you guys, at least if I could, in terms of what we're seeing from the supply chain piece of it, automotive specifically historically has been a 17 million a year sales volume in the US. This year we're forecasted to do about 14 million units. If you look at the OEMs, which are publicly traded companies, unlike my customers, they're making money and they're doing quite well. They have their challenges, as do all businesses. They don't necessarily have a reason to go back up to 17 million units based off what we see today. The reason why I bring that up is because this means that we have a lot of people who are supplying to them who are dealing with a much higher mix because everyone wants something different in their car today or different in their appliance, and we're dealing with a much lower volume. So at the end of the day, what that does is that increases the complexity for everybody that we work with. And then within that, what that does is that makes them really challenged to manage all of the supply chain pieces that we talked about. And at the end of the day, they're focused on this week, am I going to run out of cash or am I going to shut down my supplier's line, right? So, I mean, these are the kinds of decisions that these companies are facing. So I don't know if that fully answers it, but that's where we're at.
Fantastic. I'd like to open it for anyone who.
Yeah, so I'm just curious if these firms, it sounds like some of them have more demand than they can handle. So if there's a downturn in the economy, how are they going to manage it?
Yeah, so they absolutely have more demand that they can handle. From an inventory perspective, we're still well below it. We saw demand on average for them go up nearly 30% between 2020 and 2021. It's plateaued a little bit, but it's still relatively high. In terms of that demand lowering, I frankly think some of them would be, I'm not going to say pleased, but would be relieved by that. Because the intention of that demand lowering would mean, hey, maybe a couple of my 20, 30, 40 open positions I no longer need to hire for. Maybe I can take a breath to actually manage my business and focus on continuous improvement. Obviously, we don't want demand to shrink too terribly much. Right. But what I will tell you, and at least in automotive specifically, is there's pretty hefty demand planned from a tooling and new product perspective. So we have a lot of new vehicles coming out in the market in the next couple of years. It's really positive, so we absolutely have the demand to do so. The challenge is if they're able to run their businesses to still make money, even when the demand is still there. Does that help answer?
Yeah, actually, it does.
I have two questions about the long run. In my previous life, I was a professor at Michigan State, so had students from Michigan. And in my senior seminar on the current state of the economy, and I taught it for about 15 years or so, the last time I taught it was 2019. And the question that I posed at the beginning of the semester is, do you think you're better off than your parents were at this age? And for the first time in 2019, students said, post-Great Recession, they said that they thought that they were better off because they had interesting jobs that their parents had to work on the line, and that they thought these were boring jobs. So, people don't want to show up for tool and die jobs. My students' reaction would be, that's boring, that's not the Apple Store. So, that seems long-term, that seems structural. So how do you address that? I mean, how do your businesses say that they would address something like that?
Yeah.
How do you make manufacturing sexy?
Yeah, that's the end-all question that we face almost every day with our businesses. It's very challenging to make manufacturing sexy, I'll tell you that. I would tell you that if you go into the average manufacturing facility, there are floors that I would eat off of. I mean, there are impeccable facilities in this country. They're beautifully maintained. Everything from, I mean, yes, OEMs and tier ones, very large companies are doing a great job, but I walk into $10 million plants that are beautiful, have state-of-the-art equipment. You've got 20-somethings working on $1 million machines and coding that never got a 4-year degree but went to an apprenticeship program and are doing really cool stuff. The biggest challenge we have is encouraging more people to do that. The only way that we found success so far, at least our clients have, is they've focused on actually talking to the parents at very young ages, so starting in like elementary and middle school, about the benefits and the career development opportunities in manufacturing that don't require a 4-year degree. I have a 4-year degree. I know many people here have a lot more than one 4-year degree, so I understand the benefits of higher education, but it doesn't mean that everyone needs it. So we're focused very strong on trying to encourage people to go into manufacturing because I'm a nerd for it, but it's really cool.
So I have just a quick question, and this is a longer-term question too. So to what extent, because of these labor demand challenges, to what extent have businesses adopted automation to fill the labor demand?
Yeah, they absolutely focus on automation pretty clearly all the time. I was at, you spoke about big conferences. I was at the International Manufacturing Technology Show in Chicago a couple weeks ago, actually very well attended, so that was positive. I stayed at a Marriott. I'm sorry about that. But either way, we were at that show, and the core focus was on automation. So it's everything from automation within a machining cell. So if you're cutting a piece of steel, they're really focused on how do I have multiple pallets to make sure that I can do things without people, right? How can I run this machine for 24 hours and then have some guy sitting at home on his cell phone being able to monitor it? Because, I mean, they have that technology today. Every machine monitoring company will give you an app on your phone. So they're focused quite a bit on that piece of it. There's also a lot of automation in terms of lifting and material handling, and even in terms of some of the warehousing pieces of it as well. So how do I get a machine to wrap a box? And how do I get, frankly, any automation to do what even in manufacturing we may call the less intriguing jobs, so that we can have people actually making parts and actually designing and actually checking quality and doing the things that are, what I'll say, more fun than packaging a box of parts, right? We have, at this point, automation that can do that.
I just had a quick question. I think Chris and I are kind of going in the same direction on these questions, and I'll ask it to you, but anybody else can jump in. So in a normal economy, if demand softens a lot, first thing businesses do, they often will lay off workers. This seems like an unusual economy where businesses have been scrambling to get workers for so long. If demand softens, do you think they would respond differently this time in terms of those workforces, or do you think they just would do the kind of usual playbook in terms of trying to shrink costs?
Right, yeah. It probably depends on the business a bit. Obviously, everyone's different, and I don't know all of them, but I do think they would approach it differently. I think one of the things that, at least in our space, they may consider doing is looking more closely at who is it that may actually be close to retirement age anyway, that we could help them, and now they maybe feel comfort to be able to leave the workforce. And then how do we get that tribal knowledge out of that individual before they leave, right? The big thing with our workforce is going to be that the people who may necessarily want to leave the workforce at some point in time, they have all of the knowledge on how to do everything, every average good that we see in this country, right? There's some guy sitting in an office that's a tool maker that knows exactly how to manufacture that part. I don't think they would do massive rounds of layoffs, but I do think they would potentially strategically say, hey, frankly, let's rank our A, B, and C players, right? Who adds the most value in our business, and who are we hiring because we were just really desperate for people in this massive demand surge, and they may choose to let go of some of those individuals. But that would always, for them, be non-skilled labor. I can't see any circumstance where they would get rid of skilled labor, and would probably not be a critical mass of their workforce for the most part, at least in the privately held businesses I work with. I can't speak as much for the publicly traded guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much to all of our first panel and our panelists, Tom, Chidi, Jess, Kara. All the information that you've provided and shared with us today really just helps us better understand the data that we look at here at the Federal Reserve. So now we'll take a quick break. We'll come back in about 10 minutes, and Vice Chair Brainard will chair our second panel. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Really interesting. Thanks for your time.
Inversión, bolsa, criptomonedas. En Krolus TV no te vendemos cursos, te contamos las noticias que mueven el mercado. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española, el mejor y más útil programa de inversión y trading de habla hispana.
Vengo a presentar un programón
en directo, con las noticias que mueven el mercado y con la conducción de José Basagoiti, CEO de Trading Pro. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo de José Basagoiti y sus invitados. No te lo pierdas y podrás hacer tus consultas sobre acciones y criptomonedas en directo. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española en Krolus TV. Puedes vernos en YouTube, Fire Stick de Amazon y pronto en la televisión de tu país. Inversión, bolsa, criptomonedas. En Krolus TV no te vendemos cursos, te contamos las noticias que mueven el mercado. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española, el mejor y más útil programa de inversión y trading de habla hispana.
Vengo a presentar un programón
en directo, con las noticias que mueven el mercado y con la conducción de José Basagoiti, CEO de Trading Pro. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo de José Basagoiti y sus invitados. No te lo pierdas y podrás hacer tus consultas sobre acciones y criptomonedas en directo. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española en Krolus TV. Puedes vernos en YouTube, Fire Stick de Amazon y pronto en la televisión de tu país. Inversión, bolsa, criptomonedas. En Krolus TV no te vendemos cursos, te contamos las noticias que mueven el mercado. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española, el mejor y más útil programa de inversión y trading de habla hispana.
Vengo a presentar un programón
en directo, con las noticias que mueven el mercado y con la conducción de José Basagoiti, CEO de Trading Pro. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo de José Basagoiti y sus invitados. No te lo pierdas y podrás hacer tus consultas sobre acciones y criptomonedas en directo. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española en Krolus TV. Puedes vernos en YouTube, Fire Stick de Amazon y pronto en la televisión de tu país. Inversión, bolsa, criptomonedas.
Bien, aquí estamos ya en el plató de Krolus Televisión. Bueno, a poco de cerrar el programa, vamos con la parte macroeconómica. Como sabéis, este espacio para repasar un poco el ciclo económico. Hoy os tenemos 7 gráficos, ¿eh? Vamos con el primero, vamos a ponerlo en grande. Fijaos qué interesante, para que lo veáis bien un poco la cantidad de bancos centrales. Son 90 los que están subiendo tipos de interés. Bueno, ya hace muchísimo tiempo en este siglo no habíamos visto una unanimidad tan brutal de prácticamente todos los bancos centrales del mundo, salvo China y Japón, subiendo tipos de interés. Es decir, la inflación no es algo local, es una inflación que se ha extendido, ha permeado por prácticamente todo el globo. Repito, salvo China y Japón, que están viviendo sus particulares problemas. China con una crisis inmobiliaria muy fuerte que salpica incluso al sector financiero. Japón en esa deflación estructural, a pesar de que Japón, como decimos, está con también unas tasas de IPC por encima del 2%, las más altas en 30 años. Aún así el Banco de Japón no acaba de reaccionar. Bueno, sí está interviniendo los tipos de cambio, pero no reaccionan con políticas restrictivas. Y bueno, tenemos pues prácticamente, como digo, a todo el mundo encareciendo el precio de la deuda. Y lo hacemos, ahora vamos a ver en las siguientes gráficas, en una de las economías más endeudadas de la historia, tanto por parte del sector público, que quizás lo más llamativo, en lo que centramos la atención, pero también, ojo, el sector privado, familias y empresas, ¿no? Que quizá se nos tiende a olvidar, pero también están en una situación, desde mi punto de vista, muy delicada y muy frágil, ¿no? Pero fijaros, la cantidad es que es tremendo, es que no se veía esto, pues como os digo, prácticamente no lo he visto nunca antes en la historia. Es un ciclo para aprender porque no hay muchas fases previas en las que compararnos. Es tremenda la actuación de los bancos centrales y repito, 90 bancos centrales ahora mismo en presente subiendo en plena subida de tipos de interés. Tremendo, brutal. Vamos con el siguiente gráfico, el segundo. A ponerlo en grande y fijaros además cómo la Reserva Federal, aquí lo veis en azul, está la actual subida de tipos. Con esto quiero decir que además de tener a prácticamente todos los bancos centrales del mundo subiendo tipos de interés, que se está encareciendo la financiación, que está encareciendo el crédito, fijaros el ritmo de subida de la Fed. Nunca antes en la historia hemos tenido un ritmo tan agresivo. Esto, es que esto, si lo sumas al anterior gráfico, empezamos a ver los enormes problemas que tenemos, ¿no? Es que es alucinante y además muestra claramente lo tarde que han llegado los bancos centrales a combatir la inflación. ¿Recordáis aquello de la inflación es transitoria? El terrible daño que hizo esa mentira, porque era una mentira que, como digo, permeó en los medios, incluso en políticos, en la sociedad. Muchas personas se lo creyeron, muchas personas ligadas incluso a la MMT hablaban de la transitoriedad y que era una cosa de la oferta. Bueno, esa mentira que caló muchísimo hizo que, bueno, pues se permitiera no actuar a bancos centrales, ni siquiera a gobiernos que siguieron despilfarrando y gastando y con déficits pues cada vez más grandes, y provocaron que lo que podía haber sido controlado año 2021 haya sido totalmente descontrolado año 2022 y estemos ante este ritmo de subidas que nunca antes han sido tan agresivas. Nunca antes hemos visto a la Fed mes tras mes subiendo 75 puntos básicos, ya son 3 subidas de 75 puntos básicos, antes 50, es que es una barbaridad. Los que lleváis más tiempo en la inversión y hayáis visto otros ciclos de endurecimiento monetario, es que no hemos visto nada igual antes, y repito, claramente por detrás de la curva, no por detrás, años luz de la curva. Y repito, este neolenguaje, estas mentiras politiqués, eso es lo que pasa por politizar el Banco Central. Yo siempre lo digo, ¿no? No hay más que ver a Luis de Guindos, a Christine Lagarde, a Powell, dirigiendo bancos centrales, que no son economistas, que son políticos. Y es lo que pasa, ¿no? Se han dejado llevar más por, bueno, tratar de mantener la solvencia de los estados, tratar de financiar a coste barato los estados, a pesar de los riesgos de inflación, y por esa mentira ahora tienen que reaccionar muy tarde con el dolor que eso va a conllevar, y al final los que pagamos ese dolor somos los de siempre y los que menos nos quejamos, la sociedad. Esto es alucinante y espero que de verdad tenga sus consecuencias, lo estudiarán nuestros nietos y bueno, lo estamos viendo en presente, quizá ahora no sepamos ver la gravedad, pero por desgracia, y esto no es algo que yo quiera decir ni mucho menos, se viene un año 2023 tremendamente duro, cuando realmente el impacto de todas estas medidas restrictivas, tanto desde el lado fiscal como monetario y a tanto ritmo, calen en la economía, ¿no? Vamos con el siguiente gráfico relacionado con esto, y fijaros cómo todos estos bancos centrales subiendo tipos de interés y a este ritmo sobre esta economía. Aquí lo veis, la economía más endeudada de la historia. Hilar los 3 gráficos, los he querido poner en este orden para que hagáis cábalas. Fijaros, deuda pública, deuda privada, deuda de las familias, son 3 veces y medio el PIB en términos globales. 3 veces y medio el PIB de deuda, más de 300 trillones, es una auténtica barbaridad. Para que veáis un poco el impacto, es que esto no es la década de los 70, hay muchos economistas que intentan comparar este entorno actual con la década de los 70, que tienen ciertas similitudes, sobre todo pues la crisis del petróleo, que es una consecuencia, no es la causa, nunca es la causa, por mucho que lo quieran decir, pero desde luego en tema de deuda no tiene nada que ver una década con esta. Ahora mismo estamos mucho peor, en una situación mucho más complicada, y esto lo sabe Powell y por eso está actuando tan fuerte, que en la década de los 70. Es que este nivel de deuda, claro, es muy peligroso, y por lo tanto subidas de tipos de interés son muchísimo más peligrosas y pueden llevar mucho más fácil a quiebras y por lo tanto a crisis de deuda. Las crisis de deuda son tremendamente depresivas, ¿no? Son muy deflacionarias y, como digo, suelen generar depresión, es decir, estas reestructuraciones económicas tan dolorosas, ¿no? Con desempleo, con quiebras, lo que Schumpeter llamaba la destrucción creativa, que es bueno, pues como digo, que suele generar muchísimo dolor, y aún no lo hemos visto. El año 2023 posiblemente sea el año, por desgracia, duro, así que prepararos, yo no quiero ser pesimista ni mucho menos, trato de ser realista. Vamos con el siguiente gráfico que os traigo. Ya esto para los optimistas, como siempre digo, hoy quería traer un gráfico para los bulls, para los toros. fijaros, en la encuesta que se hacen a gestores, en este caso el All Beer que se llama, fijaros cómo estamos ya en un nivel de pesimismo, en un nivel de cortos tremendo, similar, fijaros, ahí lo marco, se marca, ¿no? Sentiment Trader, es un gráfico de la casa de Sentiment Trader, como en las últimas veces que hemos estado en esos niveles, al próximo año hemos tenido revalorizaciones de en torno al 7 o 50%, ¿vale? A año vista, cuando hemos llegado a ese sentimiento, esto por sentimiento contraria, ya lo sabéis, sería pues un catalizador alcista. Ahí os hago la pregunta, Evidentemente, aquí pasa lo de siempre, ¿no? Si esta vez es diferente, hay que entender mucho los matices, estamos en un contexto económico bastante peor, que las otras crisis que marcamos, incluso que, desde mi punto de vista, que el año 2000. El año 2000 era más burbujístico, pero en este caso creo que el ciclo es... creo que hay que limpiar más excesos que en el año 2000 y ahí lo dejo, desde el lado bursátil, quizá ya se esté ya sabéis que las bolsas evidentemente se mueven por expectativas, nunca por realidad, por lo tanto ya están poniendo en precio todo esto que estoy comentando, esta recesión que está por venir, esta crisis de deuda, creo que ya se está poniendo en precio, el Nasdaq ya cae un 30% y por tanto podemos estar no muy lejos del suelo. Yo estoy de acuerdo en eso. Creo que vamos a ver nuevos mínimos aún, eso ya sabéis mi hoja de ruta, no la voy a volver a repetir. Pero creo que de verdad ya lo estamos descontando. Falta por descontar parte, falta la capitulación, pero no debemos estar muy lejos del suelo de mercado y podemos tener, o este gráfico que estoy mostrando puede tener cierta razón siempre y cuando hagamos bastante más, o un poco más de corrección en precio y en tiempo, que es lo que espero yo. Desde mi punto de vista, y esto es una hoja de ruta que evidentemente es totalmente dinámica, tendremos que tocar por lo menos los 3.300, 3.400 SP500 y en el primer quarter del año 2023 ya con los tipos, con el 10 años de Estados Unidos por encima del 4%, podemos empezar a buscar compras de largo plazo. Mientras no tengamos eso, creo que seguiremos en este goteo bajista que estamos viendo y poniendo en precio.
The economy, and we've got representatives from 4 different community organizations. So we'll have a chance to ask related questions to hear about the people that you work with. Just stepping back for a second, if I think a little bit about the cross currents that are hitting the economy, on the one hand, we've got Americans back to school, back to work, even if they're not in work places, they're back to work. The economy really did come out of the pandemic with some strength. We recently saw a report suggesting unprecedented declines in children's poverty, even with the pandemic over the last few decades, and of course that's looking to the future. When I look more towards our retired populations, we've seen 2.25 million people retire early associated with the pandemic, and they don't seem to be coming back to the workforce. We have seen high wage growth among the lowest income workers, but looking overall, wages haven't kept up with inflation, and inflation is very high. And if we look at who bears the burden, everybody is affected by high inflation, but of course it puts special burdens on lower income families as well as on people with fixed incomes. And if we look at lower income families, they spend 3/4 of their incomes on necessities, more than twice what higher income people do. And of course, that's really concentrated in food, prices at the pump associated with the war against Ukraine. Not obvious that we're going to see a lot of relief there, and we heard a little bit about drought as well. So what I'd like to do is just drill into how the people that you're serving are experiencing some of those cross currents. So I'm going to start with Derek Chubbs. Derek is president and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank in Orlando, Florida, which is the region's largest hunger relief agency. It distributes more than 250,000 meals per day. Is that right? In 6 Central Florida counties. Derek previously led the Central Texas Food Bank in Austin, and he's held senior leadership positions at the American Red Cross and companies such as IBM, Pervasive Software, and Dell. So, Derek, welcome. We're really glad that you could be here with us. I do want to just hone in on this issue of food security and just ask you how high inflation, particularly in food, is affecting the communities you serve and your organization's ability to serve them.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to sit amongst you and advocate for those individuals who aren't able to advocate for themselves. This is extremely important. It doesn't happen often, so I cannot thank you enough for this opportunity and your willingness to listen. We've all had a couple of difficult years, and so have those we served. And we were all ready to believe that post-pandemic life was going to be back to normal. But as it turns out, for those who experience hunger or are concerned about hunger, that's not necessarily the case. Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida is one of a couple of hundred food banks that make up the Feeding America network across the country. Also one of 14 food banks that span across the state of Florida. And while my story or our story in many cases is going to be central to Central Florida, around 65 to 70% of my peer CEOs and executive directors across the country would sit here and tell a very similar story. During the pandemic, we had a strong national response. We had strong government response. We had strong charity responses, and we couldn't be more excited about that. But that enhanced support with unemployment assistance, stimulus checks, child care assistance, homeowner assistance was wonderful. But now that we've combined it with inflation, that means that the problems are cropping up all over again. What's different this time is that the level of support that we received during the pandemic is on the decline. Feeding America itself estimates there are probably during the pandemic around 53 million Americans across the country who weren't really sure where their next meal's coming from. Let's wrap our heads around that number. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of children. 1 in 5 of our babies don't know where their next meal is coming from. In Central Florida, we estimate around 500,000 are food insecure and aren't really sure where their next meal is coming from. And most of those individuals are suffering from a recovery period. I once heard a stat that was around the fact that most of Americans only had around $400 set aside for a rainy day. So think of that rainy day fund pre-pandemic. Think of that rainy day period through unemployment and the challenges that we saw during the pandemic. Think of how long it'll take to recover when you've lost a job or someone in the family has lost a job. And that basically brings us to today. In Central Florida, before the pandemic, we were distributing around 150,000 meals a day. During the pandemic, that number went up to 300,000 meals a day. And today, we're leveling off at around 250,000 meals a day. Now, let me add a little additional context to that. In 2019, around January, a gallon of milk was around $2.90. Today, it's over $4. Now, if I'm someone who was struggling with food insecurity at the $2.90 mark, the likelihood of my being able to recover from that today is somewhat slim. And I don't know about you, but very rarely do we go back to the grocery store and see those prices return back to where they were 2 years ago. So we hear so many stories from our clients. We distribute our food through a group of about 500 partner agencies. These are soup kitchens, food pantries, and the like. Some of them specialize in focusing on seniors. Some of them focus on providing food for those who are experiencing homelessness. And we're hearing a variety of different kinds of stories. They range from, I'm having to sell my food stamps in order to get my rent paid. That's today. From, the script has flipped. First there was a shutdown and lack of income and funds. Now 2 years later, we're paying back everything and it's hurting more than ever before. $40,000 or $50,000 used to really matter. And now making $40,000 to $50,000, I can barely get my rent paid in Central Florida. That's what we're looking at today. And I'm going to probably answer both of your questions that I have with this, if you don't mind. Something that we like to say frequently, and I might have been faced this myself when I first started, is the face of hunger really isn't what we think. We automatically default to this preconceived notion that you're either homeless, you're unemployed, or you just don't want to work. When a significant portion of those that depend on our services day in and day out are working families, some of them working multiple jobs. And they range from seniors, they range from who were on a fixed income, or now that the pandemic has passed and we're seeing heightened inflation, that they may be taking care of one of their own children or taking care of their grandchildren. So it's that same fixed income, but the cost is even more. In addition to that, just the normal family, we're seeing families bring in other families and families combining themselves just so they can make ends meet, and particularly when we're talking about the rising cost of housing that we continue to see. So that's what our clients are seeing, or those who depend on us are seeing on day in and day out. But those challenges, our food banks are not immune to those challenges either. We're still businesses running day in and day out trying to provide these services. And we are seeing challenges from a food sourcing perspective. Tom and I were talking outside when we mentioned the drought that's taking place. We source a significant amount of food from farmers. And if that food isn't there, then we're going to have problems sourcing it. We typically we get food, or most food banks get food in three ways primarily. There's the food that is donated to us throughout from the retail channels. There's food that's provided to us from the government, from the USDA. And then there's the food that we purchase. On the average second harvest of Central Florida, we would spend around $2.5 million on an annualized basis pre-pandemic. This past July, we had already spent $6 million. So that's then 25% increase in transportation costs. We put 22 trucks on the road every single morning. That's the cost of food that we're having to see in trying to procure that food. And that's also with the increased demand that we're seeing for that food as well. So those are some of the issues that we're starting to see day in and day out. It's short, but it's very to the point. We don't see anything ending anytime soon. In fact, we're about to go into the holiday season, and every single one of us in the room probably associates food and family with the holiday season. But there'll be millions of Americans who won't be able to do that. Millions of children who will not be able to do that based on the economic situation that we're seeing today, because so many of them simply have not recovered. And that's what we're seeing. And again, thank you again for the opportunity to just bring this issue to the surface on behalf of myself as well as my other 199 peers across the country.
Let me ask my colleagues if they have questions. If not, I do have one follow-up. So I'm still struggling a little bit. We've got this hot jobs market and wages have grown a lot and food security is really fragile and it sounds like no relief in sight. So how do I reconcile those things?
I'm not entirely sure how you reconcile those things, Governor. We're asking ourselves the same question. When the need increases, we've been able to scale so far. Again, the challenge is simply around those that we provide services to are struggling to recover. We're also seeing the demographics change a bit as well. We used to automatically associate hunger with low income. We're starting to see middle class be a part of that as well, whether it's based on the long recovery period because of the pandemic, or it's just simply challenges that they're seeing. 40% of we've seen a 40% increase in people who are seeking out our services for the first time. I wish I could hear some of those stories. I never, ever thought I would be here. We were doing fine a couple of years ago, and now we are literally struggling to make ends meet. Whatever little money we have runs out around the third week of the month. And thank goodness we have food banks that we can depend on, but there's only so much that even we can do because the gap really didn't narrow from what we are distributing on a daily basis. We're not seeing that gap today, Governor. In fact, we're seeing that number increase.
Can I ask you more? This is just kind of a data question. So of all the people you service, what fraction would be, say, elderly, retired, working poor, non-working?
We are not capturing a significant, and I can give you dated information on that. We don't have that information as of today.
Oh, okay.
All right. But what we would typically see is, let's go back to those experiencing homelessness. That was a less than 10% number. What we saw with those that were working, that was in the high 60 percentile range, pushing 70%, working at least one job, and in so many cases, even more than that. So those are the numbers that we're starting to see. We'll get new data probably toward the end of this year, but based on the fact that we're still 40 to 60% higher than we were pre-pandemic, the likelihood of those numbers changing very radically is pretty slim.
Yeah, so I guess this goes back to Governor Brainard's question. You have people who are working, they're in a hot labor market, but they're not earning enough to even have food security.
Absolutely. That is the challenge that we're seeing.
Can I just ask, if you've spent, or if you're using up $6 million by July, how do you expect to be able to continue to provide the same level of service throughout the rest of this year and then into next year? How are you thinking about how you'll be able to continue providing this vital service to these people in need?
That's a good question, Governor. Thank you. We were very fortunate during the pandemic. The community rolled out in ways that were unimaginable. But now is the time that we're spending down on those dollars. We expect at the current rate, we expect that to last maybe about another couple of years max. However, we don't see the need decreasing. We don't see the need decreasing next year, nor do we see the need decreasing into 2024. We're hoping toward the end of 2024 we may start to see things level off a bit.
Your funding comes mostly from government, mostly from private donations, from long-term foundations, or where does it tend to come from?
From a Central Florida perspective, the majority of our donations come from individuals. Which is very comforting. Around over 60% comes from individuals. So we're hoping that will continue, even though it's starting to decline, not a steep decline, but I think a significant portion of that is the thought process or the misconception that this thing is over, and it's not.
All right. Well, thanks, Derek. We're going to move next to Dr. Brenda Hellier. Brenda is the 5th Chancellor of San Jacinto College, which is the 8th largest community college in Texas and a national top 5 community college as recognized by the Aspen Institute. Before becoming Chancellor in 2009, Brenda served in a variety of roles, including Executive Vice Chancellor for Fiscal Affairs, and Executive Vice President for Resource Development, and previously was in the corporate world and a small business owner. So Brenda, thank you so much for being with us. It'd be great to hear a little bit about what jobs you are preparing your students for, whether those jobs and skills have shifted in this post-pandemic economy, and as a result, whether you've made changes to your educational offerings to help prepare your students for the job market that we're seeing today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I'm absolutely delighted. So San Jacinto College is in the Gulf Coast region. We're outside of Houston. We have this fall about 31,000 students. We are down about 2,000 students, or 6% since fall of 19, which is our prior pre-COVID numbers. We serve about 65% of our students are Hispanic, about 10% are Black, and our white population is declining about 17% right now. 42% of our students are first generation to college. And if I look by demographics, about 48% of our Hispanic students are first generation to college. Our high schools or our school districts in the area, they are about 75% on free and reduced lunch. And so pretty high economic needs there. From a standpoint of breakdown males to females, we lost a lot of males during the COVID from that enrollment standpoint. Our males had been at 41% through COVID, then they were down to 38% of our enrollment. They was almost all the decline were in our male students. We are back on a percentage right now. Where we are seeing a decline still is with our Black males coming back to school and really reaching out into them. When our enrollment, when I look at the pieces of it, our first time in college students are kind of flat right now. We had lost quite a few from those May 2020 graduates. They didn't go anywhere. When we can see that the college going rate in our community was 52% before COVID, those May 2020 graduates, it was only 45%. So I'm really concerned, where are they? How do we bring them back? We've seen increases in first-time in college students since then, but we've also seen a decline in our over 25-year-old students. And so that's an area that we're really reaching into to understand what's going on. So of our offerings, about 35% are directly tied to workforce training. And so getting into the jobs, we're in the heart of petrochemical. We're in the heart of maritime, aerospace, and then the health sciences. And so those are the major jobs we're training for. And we're very lucky for the relationships we have in our community. And when I say that, in petrochem, there's 133 petrochemical companies in our region. And so these are great paying jobs. One of our graduates will come out and make $65,000 the first year, and that's with an associate degree. The other thing that was really important is before COVID, before the pandemic, we had very strong relationships with industry. All community colleges have advisory committees made up of industry people who serve on them, working on curriculum. We also, at my college, have an advisory council. It's a chancellor's advisory council, and it's C-suite. I mean, it's our plant managers, our VPs, and our CEOs meeting with me and members of my team, and we're really focused strategically on workforce needs. So with petrochemical, right before COVID, we had opened a $60 million new training facility. And it was a facility, if you talk to industry, they'll say this is a facility designed by industry, for industry. It is a day in the life of an operator. It takes students all the way through what really is going to happen out at a plant. Even to a point, they're last semester with us, they're doing shift work. They're doing 24-hour shift work, 8-hour shifts, so that they can climb the stack. It's a 2-story, 8,000 square foot training facility, but they're doing it just like they would at a plant. And it was a total redesign of curriculum. Industry wanted to rebrand in our community because you had asked the question, Governor Cook, about people living in these areas, these jobs weren't sexy to them. It's what was happening with our youth. We didn't have a pipeline. And so we really worked with industry to redesign how we trained and how we recruited together, going into high schools, going into 8th grade, and trying to build. These are the jobs. And they're not the jobs that your parents had where it didn't take a credential. So that's been important work. We've done the same thing with maritime. We're the #1 port in the country. And I heard all the logistics problems. That's exactly what we were trying to train for. Deckhands, towboat operators, tug operators, and so again, a program designed by industry, U.S. Coast Guard approved courses. We're right there on the ship channel. People didn't even know about these jobs. So the demand is definitely there. How it's changed is through COVID, our partners were nervous that we weren't doing the technical hands-on training because there was so much remote. And so we made it really clear how we were doing hybrid. A lot of the lecture piece can be online, but the hands-on, you got to come into class and you get that hands-on. You can't learn to run a control room remotely. You can't learn to run a tug if you're not on the simulator there where you're getting that. Another area where we really saw changes is in the health sciences, nursing. And so we have always prepared licensed vocational nurses, associate degree nurses, and we had just gotten approved from the state of Texas to do a Bachelor of Science in Nursing because so many of our hospitals were going to BSN. Through COVID, that's all changed. What we're doing right now is we're working on a pipeline from CNAs, certified nursing assistants, to LVNs, to associate degree to bachelor, so that our hospitals have that team approach. And it has really been, when I called them, they were like, no, Brenda, don't stop those LVN programs at CNA. We need you to help build that pipeline. In the state of Texas, something that's been very creative that's just starting is our Texas Workforce Commissioner, Julian Alvarez, has set aside $15 million so that we can have apprenticeships in nursing programs. So before, students were doing clinicals unpaid. That was part of the whole training for a nurse. Right now, that's being redesigned so that our hospitals will have state resources to help do apprenticeships to move them into these fields. So it has really been all relationship building. Tell us how it's changed, and let's figure out how we're going to redesign this together. And it has really, I think, served us well. We had a big industry forum yesterday, about 800 people, and it was focused on petrochem and maritime. The demand for those jobs are there. The biggest thing is how do we make sure they've got the aptitude and the skills, and then how do we help build the attitude? Really building a safety culture, time management, all those soft skills that you hear about, we're building those into the curriculum. And that's what we keep hearing about from our industry partners. When I hear about the demand, same thing I heard on that side, the retirements, our companies have about 20% to 25% of their production people are ready to retire. They want our pipeline to continue. They said, don't pull back, we're hiring. And so they are pretty much hiring every recruit that we can put out of the petrochem. It's about 95% placement. And again, at a $65,000 a year starting wage, it's pretty impressive. The challenges, I can move to the second question, the barriers. The Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund that was provided to colleges has been amazing. What we were able to do with that, we received about $78 million of that. About $40 million went directly into students' hands, and so that they could finish courses. We wrote off debt. We had them retake classes. If they failed that first semester of COVID, we had them retake classes for free. We got additional training funds from Texas so that we could take people who had some college but hadn't completed, and we could pay for that. So we've been able to put a lot of resources in to get people trained and really help support them. That's all running out. And so, as you heard about the food needs, I have food pantries on every one of my campuses. We're distributing food. We have free cafe meals for students coming from our high schools who are on free and economically reduced lunches. We provide that food. Mental health counseling, huge resource that we're putting into place, and our community partners are so important for us, making sure we've got those resources. But so much of that is running out, and from a budgeting standpoint, we receive some funds from the state, about 24%, and then the rest of our budget is split between taxes and tuition and fees. We haven't had a tuition and fee increase in 5 years. We will need to have one next year. I can't sustain the salaries I'm having to pay and just the costs of operating without that. Property taxes have been our sustaining. I mean, our property tax revenues are really increasing. we operate very much from a conservative standpoint, we realize the taxpayers are huge supporters of us, and we need a great partnership. But I see tuition and fees having to increase next year. And just so you know, we're pretty economical. Our tuition rates are $78 a semester credit hour and $135 a semester credit hour. So you can go full-time with us for less than $1,300 a semester. And we also have put in place, we had started it before COVID, but we've kept it in place and we're expanding it, is open educational resources. So we've saved our students $26 million in costs related to books because we've gone all online. And so everything we're focused on is how do we reduce costs to students but deliver an excellent product. So that's kind of the summary. There's a lot happening, and I see incredible potential, but it really is how do we make help people see they've got to get the skill sets to get into these jobs.
Questions from my colleagues? Yeah.
So the partnership with industry sounds really interesting and very important. Does industry help at all with tuition or apprenticeships or things like that? It sounds like they're quite involved in.
They do. So one of the things is in our industries like petrochem and maritime, I hire people from those fields. Person running my petrochemical was a plant manager, retired. He's got those relationships, and he's building those apprenticeships and those internships. Sometimes we don't use apprenticeships because it's got some, baggage with it at times because there's some reporting requirements and things. But we get creative in the model they're going to set up. So they do pay those. They are on our campus. They're observing our courses. They're helping. So one of the things also, I need faculty who are up to date on practices. So our faculty write a paper on what they need assistance with, and they go out and do an externship. And industry pays for them to be back out at their plant so that they're keeping up. So the support from industry is amazing. We had a job fair last week for petrochem. 33 companies came out. They're helping our students write resumes, helping them interview.
Yeah.
So what is your organization's hypothesis about the gender differential with respect to men and women returning to school or your campuses or not?
So one of the things that, there's always a hypothesis, right? So that first year, so one of the things we did through COVID is we had Sanjak Cares calls, and we had 600 employees calling out to our students, those who have come back, just checking on them. Since that time, those 2 years, we've made over 60,000 calls, and it's really, they started out, we just want to check on you, what do you need from us? And at first, the males, it was more, I need to work, and I can't juggle all of this. And right now, it seems to be more the women, and it is more, I need to take care of the family. So it's all over the place. But I've been concerned about our male enrollment for a long time. And so that's been just one of those trends that we've seen. And so it is really, how do we better serve the male student also? Is there something they need from us? And those are the conversations we're having from them. From our parenting students, and about 40% of our students are parenting students. They need a childcare support, so we've used funds from HERF. We've used Perkins funds, and we're paying childcare for them now. We used to make it where we were paying it after the fact. Well, they couldn't upfront the money, so we're paying directly to the facility. So the reasons are all over the place, and everything we keep doing is, okay, how do we put a holistic student service support in place?
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to move now to Nancy Lamond. Nancy Lamond is responsible for advancing AARP's social mission on behalf of Americans over 50 and their families. She leads the federal and state advocacy work, and she also oversees public education programs, community engagement, volunteer efforts, and multicultural outreach. And we have benefited greatly from Nancy's insights. I think she's participated in 5 listens. This will be her 3rd. So welcome back, and we really appreciate your insights. So my first question, I think, relates to our earlier discussion. Where are these 2 million early retirees, and what is it that led them to retire that might be different than pre-pandemic, and are any of them coming back?
Well, let me join the chorus of people thanking you all for inviting me. As you said, I've been here before, and I appreciate coming back. But I want to add to it the importance of these listening sessions. And you were one of the first to do them, and I applaud you. You know, when you get to be my age, you've been to a lot of focus groups, and you've been to a lot of sessions where you listen to people. And we had some about 4 months ago, and I kind of tuned in thinking, well, more of the same, and it wasn't. Women over the age of 50, women between 50 and 60, and their message was, we're just invisible. We're invisible to elected officials. We're invisible to you people in Washington, and I wish they all would just walk in my shoes. And to the extent we can, I think it's hugely important, and we don't acknowledge that enough. We've just launched an effort called In My Shoes, where we invited people to send a message. We got 31,000 stories within a few days. And I just mention this because sometimes we kind of think of these sessions as not having an impact, and I know they do. And I appreciate that very much. But on to the topic you want to talk about. So first off, it's hard to overstate how important COVID was to older Americans. We turned on the news every night and heard we were the most vulnerable. We turned on the news and saw that the majority of deaths were people who looked like me and were about my age. And so all of the surveys about everybody wanting to get back to work, getting back to restaurants, et cetera, we were a little farther behind with that. And now it's a little different, but it depends on where you live. And I can't stress that too much. I have a cadre of 20,000 volunteers who work with us across the country. And you get on the phone and people from some parts of the country say, why don't you just fly out here and do some events with us? We need to be out in person. And I sit there and say, I can't get my staff to come into 601 East Street, Washington, D.C., let alone sending them out to South Dakota or North Dakota. So I mention this because it is the environment in which we're operating. And it's the environment that, to your question, I think produced, we were a good part of the Great Resignation. More people in the older age cohort retired early into the pandemic. There were a number of reasons for that. Some was that jobs disappeared in industry, especially where older women were working. And so that was part of it. Second were direct health concerns and health risks. And I don't think that would surprise anyone. Third, caregiving needs. Before the pandemic, there were 48 million people in the United States who were family caregivers. And almost overnight, that number grew. And not just for the person you might have been caring for before the pandemic, but all of a sudden, especially older Americans, were taking care of their kids and their grandkids. They were teaching as part of the remote school operation. And so all of that, I think, accelerated what we've called the great early retirement boom. The fact of the matter is, and I hesitate to say this because I know you read data more carefully than I do, we did not see a dramatic increase in claims for Social Security. A little bit of an increase, not as dramatic as you would have thought given the numbers. So what we took from that was this notion that that this may not be permanent, that it may not be a permanent step back, but it's going to be very important, I think, to watch. There is an increase of older people going back to work. Data shows it is not to the pre-pandemic level, but it's moving in that direction. And there are several reasons for that. First is, like everyone, people have been cooped up in their homes. They're anxious to get back out. By the way, we're seeing an uptick in volunteers as well. So not just going back to work, but trying to get back into the volunteer workforce. An awful lot of people looking to food banks and opportunities to serve our constituency. So we're seeing kind of more interest in going back to work. And of course, another factor in that is if you're on a fixed income or you're not working at all, you need you need to go back. And, there have been a huge number of stories about how we older boomers are sitting around with all of these resources, trying to decide on our favorite alma mater and our favorite child to give them to. But the fact of the matter is that isn't the dominant group. About half of people over the age of 65 are living on Social Security. The average benefit's about $1,700 a month, or some of their savings. So about half of people are in a situation where, particularly in the current economy, they have to think about work. And so thinking about work, either going back full-time or more likely part-time. We all think the gig economy was invented for millennials, but the truth of it is, even before the pandemic, you saw an awful lot of older so-called retirees as Uber drivers. The fastest growing cohort of Airbnb hosts were women over the age of 55, and we'll probably see that as the pandemic recedes. Airbnb is starting to see more older people putting homes up, and I think that will continue. And I guess the question is, the great imponderable is, will businesses turn to older workers? We know age discrimination is real. We do surveys all the time. We do so many surveys that I'm convinced we shouldn't do any more, because they show us that most people over the age of 50 believe there's age discrimination, because there is age discrimination, and kind of looking for opportunities. We're meeting later this week, AARP, with the Secretary of Labor, Secretary Walsh, with the leader as the mayor of Boston, in working on behalf of older Bostonians, to look at the programs that are being put in place, look at apprenticeship programs to make sure that there are opportunities for older workers. And again, by older workers, we don't just mean people over 65, but over 50. Now, believing popular culture is always far ahead of us. You may have seen this, it circulated rather widely. King Charles, 73-year-old man, finally gets job. It was very popular in my network. I don't know about you, but we really do have to continue to slug away at age discrimination. Ironically, the pandemic made organizations like ours and others work towards digital literacy among older Americans. It became necessary if you wanted to get a COVID shot, and now if you've got those kinds of skills, I think it's easier to move back into the labor force. And then finally, when I think about how people think about retirement, I always remember a New Yorker cartoon. I may have mentioned it in a previous session, which is a husband and wife standing there looking at each other, and one says to the other, we'll just squeak by if we take a late retirement and an early death.
So my second question is, last time you were here, we were talking about the difficulty of living on savings with low interest rates in a low inflation environment. Here we are. A lot of the folks you're with are on fixed incomes, but you have a high inflation environment, but also a higher interest rate environment. So just interested in hearing how are seniors dealing with this new environment of high inflation, higher interest rates.
Well, it won't surprise you. Certainly, older Americans, people on fixed incomes, are very sensitive right now to costs. In terms of, as we talk to our members, food prices are probably the highest. Gas prices are still high, even though our folks probably aren't driving as much as others. And then the third area is medical costs. And we've just worked for a number of years on prescription drug costs because it's what our members told us was terribly important to them. And we used a graphic of if milk and bread had risen as much as prescription drug prices, a loaf of bread would be $13. And it was very effective. I'm glad we got the bill through before anybody's doing graphics on what things cost now. But it really cemented for us this notion that particularly if you're older, healthcare costs, medical costs are a far more dominant factor in what you're focused on. And I would say one of the things I've taken from this period as we've talked to our members is the ongoing concern, which will go well beyond this period we're in now. How are people going to pay for long-term care? How are people, with the nursing home situation, everybody focused on care in the home. And as if that's so much easier and so much cheaper. And I think we all know it's not. And that is, I think, the abiding question for particularly older Americans and their families as we move ahead.
All right, so we're going to forego a question this time around to get Wendy in, and then we'll come back if we have an extra minute at the end. I want to now just move to Wendy Valise. Wendy is board president for Farm Worker Housing Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit in Woodburn, Oregon. FHDC provides leadership for stronger and more secure families and communities through affordable housing, social services, education, and economic development. And Wendy's a third-generation Latina Oregonian and received her BA in Business Administration from Eastern Oregon University. So Wendy, welcome. And I want to just start with asking you what you're seeing in terms of lower income households' ability to keep up with housing, rent payments, and other financial obligations. And what are the obstacles these families are facing in terms of establishing some amount of financial security?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased to be here and share the voice of our low-income residents across this country, and certainly in Oregon, and farm workers. So it is a similar story to what you're hearing. Folks are struggling. And when we talk about those that before the pandemics that were barely making ends meet, and then you compress the pandemic, they just got further and further behind. And so we're seeing very difficult choices being made by families. A portion of the residents that we serve, about half of their income is dedicated to housing. And this is we provide affordable housing, so they are having to make very difficult choices about what they do with the rest of their wages. And what we consider critical, essential items in our lives: medical care, the prescriptions, education for our children, whether that's the trades or going to community college. These are all very difficult decisions. It is in a place where families are working, their children are working. And so it's become increasingly difficult for them. In terms of the barriers, one of the key barriers is certainly language. And we learned in the pandemic that communities of color were disproportionately impacted by COVID. And so part of the work that we did at FHDC, we took a little bit of a pause in looking for land acquisition and projects. What we had to do is really provide a tremendous amount of education around healthcare and certainly COVID and resources. And so language was key to that. A lot of we were unprepared in that way, as much as we would have wished that were different. But I think it was a good lesson, and I think going forward, those are lessons that we'll use. Another factor is, and I'm going to expand a little bit about what people have been saying, we're seeing low income and middle income families struggling. So when we talk about it, I think that's really important, that these are working families, families with young children, multi-generational families, seniors, and we're seeing that struggle. And one of the struggles is when we think about ultimately in the FHDC, and I think in many aspects, I was at a groundbreaking less than a month ago. It was for our Colonial Paz, Community of Peace, in the Willamette Valley. And one of the residents, new residents, spoke, and what he said is, what is your dream? As he just moved in with his family of 3. And he said, the dream is to own a home, right? And that's where we want our residents to be. And we take a holistic approach, and we provide education, financial literacy education, what it takes to get a mortgage, how to maintain that. And part of that is being driven because if language is a barrier, we really don't want them taking their kids out of school to go to the bank with them. We want them to have the information and be informed. And so when he said that, it really touched me because part of the programs that are provided today have a cap on how much you can make. And that's a struggle for working families and saving, but then recognizing that there is so much that you can make, and anything above that then disqualifies you for some really excellent loan programs. And so I think that's a real opportunity for us to revisit. So access to down payments, loan programs, and the other two because of the pandemic that we're also seeing our barriers is, and we heard a little bit about it today, is we're really working to part of the program has always been to provide them connections for workforce development, because they do want to move out of these very minimum wage jobs, and they want to certainly earn more. And so really working towards stronger partnerships that serves this specific community, because it's a little bit different. And so I think that's one of the other areas that we'd like to see. And then, of course, healthcare services. One of the other lessons that we learned during the pandemic was that the children of the families came to us and said, we have a serious problem with mental health. And that was something that was new to us, new I think across the country. And so really working strongly with our school districts and with other community partners to bring in the right resources for our children. And I think that was now an area that I think looking forward, that's an important area for us that we will continue to partner with.
Let me just ask, the ability of your organization to provide housing security for the families in your community, I'm sure there were challenges before the pandemic. How have those challenges changed as a result of the pandemic? Are there new challenges, or do you have to face these challenges differently as a result of the pandemic?
Well, they certainly have changed. One, I am deeply humbled that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors wants to hear our voice. And as Nancy alluded to, you were one of the first, and we now have a seat at the many tables that we didn't have before. And so to me, there's been an increase in two-way communication with lots of new partners. We had strong community partnerships. There's many of us have been doing this work for many, many years. And I'm a volunteer, but many of us have been advocating and sharing our voice, but we had new partners come to the table and new invitations. And I think that's one of the, what I would call silver linings of the pandemic. The challenge will be to maintain that. There was tremendous generosity during the pandemic, and I think echoing some of the comments earlier is how do we maintain those relationships? How do we maintain those direct channels with generous donors, with key partners? How do we develop new relationships that will serve our community? Because I think one of the lessons that we learn is when we provide the right resources and the right tools, that people we give them a hand and they will lift themselves up. And so I think that is one of the things that came out of the pandemic. So communication, the two-way communication, partnerships, and I mentioned that. The other real challenge, and I mentioned this, is we took a pause on land acquisition. We were so focused on responding that we took a pause. we have the same challenges in a nonprofit world in retaining and recruiting. And so it is a thread that is, I think, fits within all of our organizations. We have dedicated, passionate individuals. However, as a nonprofit, we cannot compete with the private sector, and we certainly support our employees that want to move on, that have a better paying job and better benefits. They have families. So that was a challenge for us as well. But when we're going through this kind of pause and we're refocusing on that, we're now competing, and I believe someone else mentioned it, the construction never stopped, and it has really picked up. And so as a nonprofit, we're now competing with private developers for limited space. And that is real, that's very challenging for us in terms of a barrier that we need to overcome. In particular, because we have an organization like FHDC that is a culturally specific organization, right? We're very sensitive to the residents. We hear from them. We provide these services. They have their own leadership council. There's a very holistic approach versus a private developer, and what they're trying to accomplish it looks slightly different than what we're trying to accomplish. So I think that's another very significant barrier that we are dealing with today, and will continue. I think the key to that will be the partnerships. We have gained really wonderful partnerships with cities, with counties and the state, community-based organizations, school districts, utilities. I mean, there's been new partners, but there's still work to be done.
All right, we might have time for one question, if any of my colleagues have a question. All right, otherwise, thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it back over to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you to both of our panels. This has been enormously informative, and we get to spend a lot of time with data here at the Fed, but I personally would say I need to hear narratives. I need to hear stories about what's really going on out there for it all to sort of make sense. And so I think in that sense, we all learned a lot from you today, and we appreciate your time, and your input is very, very important to the work that we all do. So we're very grateful to your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Inversión, bolsa, criptomonedas. En Krolus TV no te vendemos cursos, te contamos las noticias que mueven el mercado. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española, el mejor y más útil programa de inversión y trading de habla hispana.
Vengo a presentar un programón
en directo, con las noticias que mueven el mercado y con la conducción de Joseba Sagoiti, CEO de Trading Pro. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo de Joseba Sagoiti y sus invitados. No te lo pierdas y podrás hacer tus consultas sobre acciones y criptomonedas en directo. De lunes a jueves a las 3 p.m. hora española en Krolus TV. Puedes vernos en YouTube, Fire Stick de Amazon y pronto en la televisión de tu país.